Bilibili is an absolutely massive video streaming site in China, and it's basically the equivalent of YouTube over there. Imagine all the art knowledge you've learned on YouTube and think about the fact that there's another hidden world out there that is inaccessible to you. It is honestly crazy to me that there isn't any other videos about this out there. So as someone who also speaks Chinese, I'll be attempting to bridge this gap by sharing with you what I've learned from possibly one of the best hair tutorials I've ever watched. The video that finally made painting anime hair click for me. So I've broken the instructions in the video into 6 simple steps, and I'll be going over them in addition to sharing other art lessons I've learned along the way. This first step is sort of optional depending on the lighting situation you're going for, but if you're going for this type of art style and want a dynamic, flashy type of lighting situation, then this is a must. Oh, and by the way, I've also shared all the brushes I used in this for free, in addition to the line art and layers files. So you can do the exact same follow along study. Anyways, to start off, we use the multiply blending mode and fill in the entire hair. Then we erase the parts of the hair that are exposed to the light source. This step is important because it defines the location of the light source. You're making a clear statement about where the light source is, and this will greatly help you for the later steps. And it just instantly adds a lot more contrast and interest into the painting. After we've painted this on, we use the smudging tool and soften the edge a little bit. Use a sharpen brush to add a bit more variety to the shadow. And then I blur this a little bit as well, although not as much as the original shadow. And then we also erase some of the other parts of the hair that are directly facing the light source. The next step is to have a transitioning color on the hair. Lots of artists like to call this the Terminator color, and it's a very popular thing that artists like to add to their paintings. It's due to how the light reacts when it transitions between light and shadow. But all we have to do is pretty simple. Use the soft light blending mode and pick a more bright and saturated color. Then you simply use a soft brush and add a soft transition on the line between the light and the shadow. This instantly makes the hair feel more alive and gives it a sort of glow. Do this to all parts of the hair that have a transition. Now we're on to a classic step in rendering, and there's some very useful tips that the video gave. In this step, we're just aiming to fill in some of the big shadows you'd expect, based on the light source and from the way that the hairs overlap. The artist emphasizes here the importance of painting in terms of triangles. When in doubt, paint the shadows as triangles for the hair. And try to avoid any four-sided shapes unless you really know what you're doing, because it is very easy to make the hair ugly if you use four-sided shapes. There's no need to go too overboard in this step, since we're going to be adding more shadows later on. Now we're on to everyone's favorite step in painting anime hair, the highlights. And in the video, she went over a neat little way to paint the highlights. This is by making a big, long brushstroke, and then sectioning out the highlights by erasing parts, and then erasing some more to define the shape. Also, make sure you're using the add blend mode for this. The add blend mode is good for this because when you erase some parts, it reveals some of the underlying color, and it just looks good in general. And again, pick a color somewhere here. Now we just adjust the shape of the highlight to give it a bit more randomness. A general rule is to have the highlights at the peak of the head be the biggest, and then have a slight taper in size from there. An interesting thing to note here is that she's painting the highlights in the shadow side of the hair, which should not make any sense. But she explains this as anime things. But you can see that lots of other professional anime artists also decide to put highlights even when the hair is in shadow. This basically just boils down to, if it looks good, then it works. And in the end, it's up to you where you put the highlights. You can paint it up here if you like, but I also feel that painting it in the shadow side just looks better for some reason. We also add some highlights here on parts of the bangs. This again just comes down to a stylistic choice. And an important thing she says is to make sure that this highlight is not brighter than the original highlight. This step is pretty important. It adds extra dimension and appeal to the painting, all while being incredibly easy to implement. So what we do is we create another add mode and we color pick the skin color. We paint with a soft airbrush to add a slight gradient and glow to the hair. And this was done with a non-clipping mask layer, so you get some glow on the skin as well. The purpose of this step is that it makes the hair look less heavy and gives it a slight impression of see-throughness. Additionally, we also paint some of this glow in the back parts of the hair and here as well. This is a very common technique that anime artists use. It just gives the hair an overall more ethereal feel and makes the hair look a lot better, all while being very easy to add. I mean, all we did was paint back and forth with a soft airbrush. This next step is very important because this is where we add the definition shadows to really make the hair a lot more detailed and to make this a fully rendered hair. Definition shadows includes shadows that are caused by the 3D form of the hair turning away from the light source. The technique she uses to paint this is very simple. If you look at some of the clumps of hair like here, we just take a sharp brush, paint it in, and then blur it. And just like that, doesn't it already feel like the clumps are a lot more defined? So anywhere where it felt like the hair was a bit too uniform, or where it feels like the hair is turning away from the light source, we can do something like this to make the hair really pop. And this wasn't in the original painting, so this is optional, but I also added more definition / shadows to the hair after this. This just adds more detail to the painting, and I think the technique here is pretty worth noting. Basically, we now use a square brush to add these brush strokes on some of the tops and bottoms of the hair clumps. But the important thing here is to make sure your opacity is set low, somewhere between 20 and 40%. This is important because it allows you to very naturally layer and overlap brush strokes, which means you can easily create shadows with different levels of darkness, and you can create triangular shadows when overlapping the strokes. And if you remember from before, the artist recommends to stick to triangular shapes because it's harder to mess up. And then we also blur the tops of these shadows to alter the shape. A very useful tip here is that if you duplicate your current layer, you'll be able to better see whether the shadows you're adding is good or whether it's just garbage. Since we're adding subtle shadows, it's easy for it to look like it's not too bad since it's hard to tell what the shadows are actually looking like. But duplicating it allows us to better see whether we might need to correct some of the shape language. So now we're basically finished with the hair, but there's also some bonus tips that the original video went over if you want to add some extra detail and appeal to your painting. It's good to just play around with this and decide whether or not you like the change. Firstly, we can add a slight rim light to some parts of the hair by using the add mode. This is the last one, I promise. This is good for giving the hair an extra pop. If you feel like the rim light isn't prominent enough, you can darken the bit next to it as well. Next, if you feel like the contrast in your hair isn't strong enough, then we can create another add layer. Okay, this is actually the last one. And refine the brightness of the light source a bit more. Just adding more light to the areas where we previously added light. But be careful with this because it's easy to make the lights overblown. Lastly, if you don't really like the color of the hair or want to give it a bit more color variation, then we can duplicate the hair and use gradient maps. This is the technique I like to use to duplicate things with multiple layers when I need to merge them. Now we can play around with the colors and set the mode to something like overlay or soft light and reduce the opacity. We can also play around with the original color of the hair. And now we're done. I think it looks pretty good, doesn't it? And it was so easy to do that I truly believe anyone watching this video could do this as well. Once again, these were the steps. And this technique can be used on basically any anime hairstyle. If you're interested, I can make a part 2 video demonstrating this technique on different hairstyles. Let me know what videos you would like to see in the future. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Anyways, thanks for watching.